Now, here are Morgan Streetman and Roxanne Wilder.
No Roxanne Wilder this morning. Right about now, you hear that smooth-sounding voice from Roxanne, and now everyone's just stuck with us.
She's so smooth.
She has such a good-sounding voice.
We
I
love
love
having her
listening to that voice. And no voice today.
Just me today, Pat George. Just me.
Yes.
Unless we're lucky enough to get a caller. And,
you stir up enough action. We'll get some callers. Don't you worry about that.
We probably will.
Anything going on?
Oh, we got a few things going on, Pat George. You know, I was out last week, so I got a few things to catch up on with the audience here, with all of our listeners. And if you do want to get on the horn with us today, the number to call is 888-404-1010. Now, I want to point out to the listeners who are listening here with us at 10 a.m. here in Tampa, 10 in the morning, that we actually, our second running of the show, which occurs every Monday, has been moved to 6 p.m. to 7 p.m., which is actually really cool because it was moved to make way for the Schnitt Show, which is a new show that's being produced out of our – well, it's not a new show. I shouldn't say it's a new show. But it's now being produced out of Money Talk 1010 here and runs live from 3 to 6 every day. So, and it's a conservative radio show, so it should gel with some of our listeners.
We just had you stirring it up all the time, and now we got him. So with both of you guys, we have bookends.
It's a powerhouse.
Yes.
It's a powerhouse. Well, as you can hear, my voice is not too strong today. I don't know why. I mean, you know, I was sick a couple of weeks ago, and then there was all kinds of issues with the studio, and now today my voice is just a little bit weak when I woke up this morning, but I'll do my best to get through. So if you hear it breaking up just a little bit, that's what it's due to. But we do have so many things to cover today. I mean, we have got, I don't think we're going to get through it all, as usual. And we got some good clips for you. And we're going to try to play some of those. We're going to try to bring some context to some of the discussions that are going on. In fact, I had a discussion with Roxanne this morning about some of the issues. And she was asking me about some of the latest breaking news relating to Sidney Powell. And we'll try to get to some of that later in the show today. But we want to try to keep some of our formatting that we have had for so long now. We've been on for more than 5 years now. I want to keep some of our formatting. So we tend to try to start out with our quick look back segment. And we're looking back today at something that's coming again to our world. Now, luckily for those of us that live here in Florida, we've got a great governor here in Florida. And I don't think we're going to fall victim to another series of COVID lockdowns. But certainly in the rest of the country, people that are in power, particularly Democrats in power, are hot to trot to lock everybody down again. That's their main goal, lock everybody down. They think that somehow, if we all just stayed in our homes, and of course they're now even saying wear masks in your homes with your own family members. That's a new thing they want to enforce.
I see more and more people wearing their masks in their car, even when they're by themselves.
Every time I see that, I have to chuckle. But I guess maybe you're protecting yourself from yourself, except for the fact that you're rebreathing all that air. If you had the virus, I mean, it's just going right up back into your face while you sit there with your mask on. Not to mention, I mean, we don't even want to get into whether masks are effective or not, because I think there's some very real question as to whether they're even effective based on the studies, and particularly the way that we've said, look, a cloth face covering is sufficient. I mean, these are not N95 masks that you see people wearing. It's basically, cut out from a piece of pantyhose strapped across most people's face, and particularly those of us, and I don't thankfully have to do this, but those of us that have to wear one where we work. I was down in Key West a few weeks ago, and all the bartenders had to have one on. Well, I mean, if you can imagine how hot it is down there, I mean, it's just sweltering.
Now there's a fine if you're not wearing it in Key West.
Exactly. And so, what they've got strapped across their face is the thinnest piece of cloth that they can possibly get a hold of. And you can't blame them because they're just trying to breathe. I mean, it's suffocating to be in a mask all day in this way. So, but these COVID lockdowns are coming everywhere. But the point that I wanted to make on this, and the point that I think that should really resonate with folks at home, because, we're the subjects, right? We're the ones who are ruled by the rulers, by the great ones, the ones who know better than we know, who can decide for us how we need to live our lives. I mean, look, if you want to wear a mask, there's no rule against that. You can wear a mask anywhere you want, including in your car by yourself, at your home with your family. It's your life. Do whatever you want to do. I support that 100%. But now the question is, when it comes to my life, do you get to decide, or does somebody get to decide what I do in my life? And that's got to be a question that we're all asking ourselves. Do we want to be ruled by somebody, or are we capable of deciding for ourselves how we're going to live our own lives.
And knowing you as long as I have, that is a hot button with you.
It is a hot button. I don't like these people, these rulers, particularly because they're all a bunch of hypocrites. And we see that displayed in the way that they behave. Because the rulers, they make rules for the rest of us, kind of like Gretchen Whitmer up in Michigan. Nobody's allowed to travel. Nobody's allowed to go to their summer homes. Nobody's allowed to do anything in Michigan except for her husband. Her husband's allowed to do whatever he wants. Well, we got another couple of examples of this recently. You know, there was a party that they held in Brooklyn among some of the different city council members and other local leaders there, and they got some photos from that. And that's actually not the main story, but it was just another example recently. And you look at all these photos, and these people are having this party, and only about 1 in 10 of them are wearing a mask at the party. Now, this is supposed to be COVID hot zone, right? Brooklyn, New York. This is ground zero for COVID infections. And here are the leaders, and when they're having a special party and they want to talk to their friends, because they know they know you don't need to wear a mask. That's what they know. I mean, that's the reality. If you really needed to wear a mask, they'd be in a mask. But none of them are in a mask. They just want to make rules for the rest of us. And we had another, and this was a story that I wanted to talk about. We had another great example of this coming out of California. You know, Nancy Pelosi's nephew, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, they got California back under a lockdown. In fact, he's color-coded the entire state back into the Stone Age. Everybody's under purple control now. Purple control, what's that mean? Phase 1. Can't go anywhere, can't do anything. There's a curfew in place. Nobody's allowed to do anything except for Gavin Newsom and his people. When they want to go to Napa Valley, wouldn't we all like to, and they want to go to French Laundry, one of the finest restaurants, Michelin-starred restaurants in Napa Valley, you know, several $100s a plate, I'm sure. I've never been fortunate enough to be able to go there, you know. Most of us can't afford to go eat like that. But Gavin Newsom somehow can on his government salary with all his buddies, his political cronies. And lo and behold, guess what? Somebody took photos. I'm betting somebody on the wait staff. Because they're probably looking at this bunch of hypocrites, this bunch of rulers, telling everybody else what to do, but not doing it themselves. And nobody in that group is wearing face masks. They're all sitting around. Nobody's social distancing. Nobody's following any of the rules that they make for the rest of us. They're not following them. Now, it's like this old phrasing, rules for thee, but not for me. And that's the way they live our lives because they think they are our rulers. These are a bunch of authoritarians, a bunch of actual fascists. That's what we're dealing with here. This is actual fascism. The stuff that Antifa, the supposed anti-fascist group, protests, you know, free market, capitalism, that's actually not fascism. But the language has become so corrupted that the actual fascists, like Gavin Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer and others, they're called progressives. They're the actual fascists, though. But the point that you want to take home with you is that they don't follow their own rules. And if they don't follow their own rules, why should any of the rest of us? And people are up in arms about this. When we saw some video out of Buffalo, New York, where they again put in place one of these draconian fascist lockdowns in Buffalo and said local businesses, you can't have anybody over, you know, one person per 1,000 square feet or whatever the exact details was. And the details aren't really what matters. The point is they're shutting down the ability of these businesses to operate. So a bunch of local business owners, small business owners, got together and met in this one particular business, and they wanted to talk about what are we going to do about this? How are we going to try to survive? What's our game plan for this? And you can watch the video that's out there. Of course, the mainstream media won't make it accessible to you, but if you dig for it a little bit, you'll find it. And lo and behold, a health department bureaucrat shows up with the sheriffs in tow. And it's a shocking video. Obviously, somebody got wind that they were having this meeting and thought, you know what? We're going to go down there and we're going to intimidate these people. We're going to show them that you don't get to question authority. You don't get to do it your own way. We're going to come marching in here and we're going to do something about it. Well, what was so amazing, if you watch this video, is the people in the business were not having any of it. In fact, they got right up in the faces of these invaders, these bureaucrats, these functionaries, these communist apparatchiks, these people, these party members who want to come in and boss everybody else around, people who actually work for a living, who generate economic activity, who make it possible for all the dependents Everybody wants to be a dependent now. For all the dependents to live, we're going to need some independents. We're going to need some producers. We're going to need some business owners if you people all want to live off somebody, because you ain't going to be able to live off each other when everybody's dependent on everybody. So these people show up, and they're going to tell these business owners what the story is and how it's going to be. Well, the business owners say, get out of our business. You are trespassing. And remember, there are 2 sheriff's deputies here, and they got on these like SWAT vests, like they're going to, like this is going to be a raid or something. And they keep screaming at him, get out, you're trespassing. Well, it takes about 2 minutes, but you know what happens? They walk those people right out of the business. The sheriff's people, the health department people, they all folded and walked right out of the business under the screams of these business owners to get out. They were trespassing, and that's what we need to see. And welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. Well, Pat, I can already tell that at the speed that we're moving, we're not going to get to everything today. And I had some interesting stuff on Hunter Biden and some of the shenanigans that he was involved in. I don't think we're going to make it all the way to that because I do want to.
It isn't true. I want to hear that.
I know. I do want to cover. Well, you know what? We need to lobby for a longer show. I do want to cover, though, a lot of the election fraud issues, and I did have a local interest for us. So we'll have to come back to that because I understand we have a caller. And is he on now? And you said it was Jerry? Jerry, yes. Good morning. Hey, how are you doing?
I'm fine. How are you, Morgan?
Great. Thanks for calling. Tell me what you want to talk about today.
Well, I'll tell you what. I think there's a lot of negative press aimed to discourage MAGA supporters and marginalize the Trump legal effort. I think we need to resist throwing in the towel because there are indications, I think, that the Democrats could be running scared. There was a law firm representing Pennsylvania Secretary of State, which had to withdraw because one of their attorneys threatened his counterpart on the Trump legal team. And apparently the threat was serious enough that the U.S. Marshals and local police offered to protect the attorney. Now, I'm not a lawyer. But I would think there could be some legal jeopardy for the firm or the lawyer which issued these threats. And if the opposition is so sure of themselves, why would they risk such a situation?
Well, that's a great point, Jerry. And I know the story that you're talking about, and I actually personally know the lawyer that was threatened in this story. Now, I haven't talked to her. Her name's Linda Kearns. I haven't talked to her since she was threatened, but I did look into the story, being that I saw the story come out and I recognized her name, and I said, oh, my goodness, it's Linda. So basically, she was representing President Trump and the other plaintiffs in some of the litigation in Pennsylvania. And over the weekend, I think it was last weekend, she was actually received a phone call from a lawyer with the firm representing the Pennsylvania Secretary of State. And the phone call, the guy was dumb enough to leave a voice message on her voicemail and made some kind of threatening comments. Now, I have looked at the court filings, and they don't specify exactly what the threatening comments were, so I can't read them to you in their gory details. But like you said, Jerry, it was enough to trigger U.S. Marshal protection for Linda Kearns. Now, she's ended up withdrawing from the representation. I don't know if that's because the heat has gotten too hot. I mean, she's just a solo practitioner lawyer. This lawyer at the other firm, it's pretty interesting. It's a big firm. It's one of the biggest, Kirkland and Ellis, one of the most storied law firms in the country. And it's interesting because when I was reading up on this ahead of time, she actually confronted the partner handling the case because this apparently was an associate. And their initial position was, you can't prove that voicemail came from us. And then when she was able to prove to them that the voicemail did come from one of their Kirkland and Ellis issued cell phones, then they took the position that, that was just a junior associate, and the associate was acting unilaterally. And now I'm quoting from him, the associate was acting unilaterally in his personal capacity without the knowledge or authorization of undersigned counsel or the firm. And of course, what ultimately happened was the firm had to withdraw very shortly thereafter, probably was fired, but probably had to withdraw even if they weren't fired because now they have somewhat of a conflict of interest now that one of their lawyers, and they should be charged with responsibility, right? Respondeat superior, let the master respond. If they're the employer of this alleged junior associate and he's made this phone call, well, guess what? They're on the hook for it. Now, they're obviously trying to distance themselves by saying he did it in his personal capacity, but that doesn't really make any sense because, I mean, the law firm's representing the Secretary of State, Ms. Bukvar, and he's part of the law firm, and he calls opposing counsel regarding a case that they're both working on. That doesn't sound like he's acting in his personal capacity. It does sound like he's way out of bounds. There was obviously some kind of threat to the attorney's physical security to trigger U.S. Marshal protection for her. And that kind of behavior is so completely out of bounds for an attorney, but it's becoming the norm. I'm not saying it's becoming the norm for attorneys, but if you look at what was done by the Lincoln Project about this same time, where they made efforts to what they call dox or reveal the personal contact, the names and personal contact information of other attorneys who were representing President Trump and other plaintiffs in these election lawsuits. They've doxed them, and they've said, sure would be a shame if some of our followers did something about this. I mean, they don't have to put the fine point on it, do they? I mean, what they're suggesting is harass these lawyers, and maybe even more than that, maybe even more than just verbal harassment, leaving threatening phone messages on their phones. Maybe they mean, do something more like what Antifa does, showing up at people's houses, breaking windows, starting fires, like has been done in Washington, D.C. to Tucker Carlson and other journalists we've seen. Antifa doesn't fear showing up at people's houses. And essentially, I mean, the threat of violence is there. It's right under the surface if it's not made explicitly. So now, Jerry, the point that you're bringing up, which is such a great point, is that if they didn't have something to worry about, they being the Democrats, they being the Secretary of State of the state of Pennsylvania and her law firm that's representing her, if they didn't have something to worry about in the case, why would they need to do something like this? Why do they need to resort to these extrajudicial measures to try and win the case? Hey, we're not going to defeat the lawyer in court. We're going to scare her off the case by threatening her. I mean, that is so far removed from the way a lawyer ought to be behaving. And I also want to say I'm a little bit embarrassed at some of these lawyers. Now, we don't know all the details of all the threats that were made to them, but with respect to the ones that got off the case because of the Lincoln Project doxing them and revealing their personal information, a lawyer is supposed to be kind of that person who stands in the gap, who's willing to, put ethics and the needs of the representation of their client ahead of their own personal interests. That's the ultimate goal of the lawyer. To kind of describe it, it reminds me of the old sheriff out west, when they have the criminal who probably is a real criminal, but he's in jail and he's going to be tried when the hanging judge comes around in a few weeks or whatever, and the mob shows up, and the sheriff goes out in front of the jail with a shotgun, and he says, "You're not getting to this criminal except through me." That's kind of what the lawyer is supposed to be like. Now, that's just an analogy. I'm just trying to paint a word picture for folks who are listening so they can understand that the lawyer's supposed to stand up to popular pressure and not supposed to cave under this type of pressure, whether it be from colleagues or from members of the general public, and you're supposed to represent your client. But what we've seen is all the really high-end law firms that were representing the president have all kind of abandoned him under this type of pressure. Now, again, I want to say we don't know exactly what threats were issued and exactly what's been said to them, why they felt that maybe for their own personal safety they just had to get off the case. But I'll just say what a shame. I mean, what a shame that that's how the business gets done. And, hey, if there's nothing to hide, Biden campaign, office of the president-elect or whatever other office they want to make up, if there's nothing to hide, then why not let the legal process work? Because if there's nothing to hide, then there's nothing to fear. And at the end of it, you're going to be victorious. So let these people spend all their energy fighting you because at the end of the day, you're going to be victorious. The only reason to resort to these kind of, out-of-bounds activities like threatening people with physical violence is because at the end of the day, if they keep digging, they're going to find something major, and it may be enough to overturn the election. And based on what I've seen and what a lot of us have seen, there's something there. The mainstream media is trying to push this narrative that there's not even any smoke and there's certainly no fire. But anybody who's taken a little bit of time to look at this beyond the headlines and not just go with what the AP says or what the New York Times might say or the Washington Post might say, and you actually dig into some of these stories that you can find in the local press in some of these counties, you'll find major, major issues. And that's something we're going to go over as we get into the next segment. But, Jerry, did that answer your question?
I sure did. And, if I didn't know any better, I would say that some people want us to head to a one-party system, but that's just me.
Well, Jerry, I have to agree with you. And there are even people who suggest that that's essentially what we've had for many years now, that the Democrats and the Republicans are so similar, and they call it the uniparty, the one party, the uniparty. And it's these guys you see on TV. They've got the world's biggest collection of purple ties, right? They love the purple ties because, right, the Democrats are blue, the Republicans are red, but they merged the two, and they're purple. And they represent themselves. They represent the ensconced financial interests that make so much money off of this country. And what do I mean by this country? I mean, that's mine and your tax dollars that we pay to the federal government every year. All that money that flows up from all the states to Washington, D.C., and then gets distributed out to all these boondoggle projects that half of us don't even support. We don't even want our money going to it. You don't think there's plenty of graft and corruption in the movement of all that money? There absolutely is. And the people wearing the purple ties are telling you they are part and parcel of it. They are the uniparty, and they're in it for themselves. They're not in it for we the people. We're going to talk some more about election interference when we come back. And welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. Before the break, we were going to get into talking a little bit about some of the voter fraud issues. But before we do that, I want to do our local interest segment. And this is one you're going to have to do some of your own research on and look this up if you want to. A pretty disturbing story out of Lakeland over the weekend. I don't know if you saw this, but a coach at Lakeland High School, a varsity soccer coach and tennis coach, he's been there since 2004, was arrested on 408 counts of child pornography. And some of the children in the videos that were found on his devices were as young as 10 months old. What a sicko. Anyway, that's a story. We're not going to give you his name, but you can look into it. Just type Lakeland High School child pornography, and you can watch the Grady Judd press conference and find out all the gory details. But you talk about disturbing. I mean, imagine if your child, your son or daughter, was a student at Lakeland High School. I mean, you would be pretty upset, I think. Now, before we were taking the break, we started talking about how there were all kinds of indications of voter fraud. And this is both retail and wholesale. And I want to get to the wholesale because we've got some really interesting stuff to cover with you on the wholesale aspect of it. And that's like the voting machines. And we want to try to get to that. We're fast running out of time on the show. And I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of it, but I'm going to try to cover some of it for you. But before we get there, you have to think about all the retail fraud that we saw in this election with the mail-in voting. I mean, we saw the wrong people voting, dead people voting twice or more, including in states where they didn't live. I mean, this is endemic to the concept of just wholesale mailing out ballots to everybody, not even having the correct addresses where these people might live, and then you receive the ballots back. And who knows who voted those ballots, right? Because, remember, they turned off the signature match verification, or they turned it down so low that any kind of a written signature is going to pass the match verification. That's what they did in Las Vegas. Anything at all, any scribble would pass. And in many states like Georgia, they wouldn't even examine the signatures to see if they matched the signature on record for that particular voter. So if you got somebody's ballot to your house, there was apparently no real risk in just filling it out, scribbling something in the signature, and mailing it back. Heck, your ballot may have even gotten counted on their behalf as their vote. And we have stories of people showing up to vote and being told, sorry, you already voted by mail-in ballot. We had stories of ballots being added, physical ballots being moved in en masse in places like Detroit and other places There's a story out of Georgia with pristine ballots being counted, supposed mail-in ballots that had never been folded. Well, anybody that's ever done a mail-in ballot, like many of us here in Florida have done, you got to fold it up to go in the envelope. Well, here's a pristine stack of ballots that never got folded. You had in Detroit and Philadelphia and other places, poll observers were being kept out, watchers were being kept out. Now, why would you want to keep somebody out? This happens every election. You have poll watchers. And now not only are they being kept out, but then the Supreme Court, like in Pennsylvania, is coming in and saying, hey, it's fine to put them 100 feet away from where the actual counting is going on because they still get to observe it, albeit from, quarter of a mile away. That's an observation. That under the definition of observation, that counts. Well, here would be my suggestion. Why are we doing it different than how we always do it? You always have these poll observers and poll watchers who can stand up close and actually watch the count being done and catch and check things. That's the whole purpose of them. But this election had to be different. And if there was nothing to hide, why did they have to close these people out? How about the vote counting stopping in the middle of the night? Remember that? It just stopped. Everybody went home. I've never heard of that before. Nobody's ever heard of that before. We always count to the end. Remember the water main breaking in I think it was Gwinnett County and right near Atlanta? Everybody had to go home. The water main broke. Well, guess what? They've done public records requests on that. No water main broke. There was just a very mild leak, and it was nowhere near any of the voting equipment. This is coming from the only public records that were returned were some text messages between somebody and the head of facilities there. And that guy said, hey, this has been blown way out of proportion. There was no break. There was no emergency. It wasn't near any of the voting equipment. Essentially, it's a made-up story. But has the mainstream media come back and corrected any of that? No, they haven't. We've got stories of people being offered incentives to vote. We got stories of people harvesting ballots or voting for other people in nursing homes, mental hospitals, even large groups of homeless people. People have been indicted for this stuff. And then you've got, of course, the statistics that look so suspicious. There's one, we'll try to run through a few specifics here, and then I think I want to turn into the voting machines, and that will flow through our Out There. We'll replace some of the Hunter Biden stuff we were going to do in the Out There with covering some of these voting machines issues. There's been so much fraud in this election. Even the Federal Election Commission chairman, Trey Traynor, has confirmed that this election was absolutely rife with fraud. And that's a pretty serious statement. He's the guy in charge of it. Let's hear from him specifically.
But do you believe there is voter fraud out there, specifically in Pennsylvania and other states that are weighing heavily in on this election?
I do believe that there's voter fraud taking place in these places. Otherwise, they would allow the observers to go in. When you have claims of, 10,000 people who don't live in the state of Nevada having voted in Nevada, you have the video showing where people are, they're either duplicating a spoiled ballot right there, or they're in the process of just marking a ballot that came in blank for a voter. That's a process that needs to be observed by election observers. State law allows those observers to be in there. And if they're not, then the law is not being followed, making this an illegitimate election.
All right.
Think about that. That's the guy that's the head of the Federal Election Commission. He's saying there's fraud. He's saying there's major issues all over the place. And he just pointed out a couple of them in that particular interview. Now, what's so interesting is that, 70% of Republicans believe that it is somewhat or highly likely that this election was stolen from Donald Trump. The more interesting number, I think, is that 30% of Democrats believe that it is either somewhat or highly likely that this election was stolen from Donald Trump. People can use their common sense. They can see it with their two eyes, despite all the efforts of the mainstream media to program us to tell you there's nothing to see here, nothing happened. This is just the will of the people. Despite all those efforts, people can see this with their own two eyes, and they can understand something fishy is going on here.
Could you say this was a coup?
You could say that. These are characterizations, right? You can characterize this in terms of a coup, an attempt to unseat a duly elected leader or leadership structure of a country. And that is just one characterization of it. What happens, I think, is that people get a little bogged down in some of the language. And some people say, well, you can't say that. You can't say treason. You can't say coup. You can't say this. That sounds too out there for a lot of people. And that's too bad, because what we're talking about just at the basic level is that this election was not sound. The will of the people is not being done. Whatever you want to end up calling it, there's issues with this, and why don't we want this looked into? Those of us who voted, which is a lot of people did vote in this election. Why wouldn't we want our votes to count just the way they're supposed to? One person, one vote, right? Now, if you've got all these other people, these non-entities, people voting twice, people who aren't even being given a ballot, but somebody else is voting their ballot, et cetera, your vote isn't counting because it's being outweighed by the fake votes. You know, there was a lady in Michigan, a civil servant. She's a career civil servant named Jessie Jacob, and she signed in an affidavit saying that she personally witnessed and in some instances was actually instructed to backdate thousands of absentee ballots the day after the election to make it appear as though they had legally arrived in time to be counted with the election. And this is very similar to the story that we heard out of Project Veritas, where they had the postal worker in Michigan who reported the same kind of thing, that they actually backdated the postmarks on a lot of these envelopes by orders coming down from their superiors. And he was willing to swear to that. And these people are putting a lot on the line when they're willing to speak up on this. But her sworn statement says that she estimates that this was done to thousands of ballots, and that she witnessed, in addition to that, witnessed Detroit poll workers skipping voter ID checks. And in fact, she says, she swears to the fact that she was instructed by her supervisor to adjust the mailing date of the absentee ballot packages. So we've got multiple examples of this. She also says that there were 70 to 80 other poll workers who also were instructed to falsify ballots. Now, if she saw thousands, you multiply that by 70 to 80 other poll workers, you're talking about tens or maybe even hundreds of thousands of votes that were illegally counted. And this is a very important city. You know, it's one of the few that, Joe Biden ran away with. Detroit, Philadelphia, Atlanta, there's only a few of these, Milwaukee, where they won the election. Everywhere else was Trump country, except for these few where it was really an outsized turnout for Joe Biden, and it ended up flipping the very states. Another story out of Michigan, nearly three-quarters, I almost said two-thirds, but it's even more than that, nearly three-quarters of Detroit's precincts, that's Wayne County, had mismatched voting totals. And that means, this comes from one of the Board of Canvassing members, a guy named William Hartman, who signed a sworn declaration saying that in his review of the results, he determined that approximately 71% of Detroit's 134 absentee voter counting boards were left unbalanced. Unbalanced, which means they had more votes cast than people registered to cast votes. Now, that just means there's something fishy. There's something fishy going on. Those numbers should balance exactly.
If it works this time, who's to say this isn't going to be the new lay of the land in the future?
Yeah, you're right, Pat George. If it works this time, they'll get away with it forever. Like we told you a minute earlier, there was a story out of Georgia where somebody swore in an affidavit as they were observing the supposed audit that occurred in Georgia, which wasn't actually an audit. You're talking about a razor-thin election in Georgia. I mean, 10 to 12,000 votes, very, very thin margin. That they saw an entire stack of pristine ballots that were uniformly cast. That means all of them were cast for Biden. These are the ballots that weren't folded because they were never put in an envelope. They were probably run off on somebody's printer, and they were run through the counter. There were no markings on the ballots to show where they'd come from or where they'd been processed, and the markings were unusually uniform according to the affidavits. You remember that other story out of Georgia where they found something like 6,000 uncounted votes on flash drives in 3 different counties? I mean, these stories go on and on and on, and I'm only through about half of the specific stories that I was going to call to your attention for retail fraud. How about the 160,000 ballots in Nevada that were thrown out for a local election but kept to elect Joe Biden. We're going to cover Dominion when we come back. And welcome back to the Morgan Streetman Show. You know, Pat, I was telling you during the break, it's a real disappointment because I had to leave quite a few specific stories on the table there that I was going to share with folks, including people who were actually indicted already for some of this election fraud, for registering people to vote, like homeless people, people at mental institutions, people in nursing homes who had no idea that they'd voted because they didn't vote. These votes were stolen and counted, and that's some of the retail fraud that we know about. And I'm sure it's the tip of the iceberg. But I wanted to get to some of these issues on the voting machines because that may be where the even bigger fraud is. And I expect that in the next couple of weeks, we're going to see some of the evidence that Sidney Powell claims she has on this. And as I've told a lot of people, for a lot of reasons, having followed Sidney Powell's career, I'm inclined to have a little faith in her. Now, there was some kerfuffle over the weekend with her being stated as not being a part of the Trump legal team. And we really don't have time to get into all that because I want to get into this stuff, which I think is more important than that. But why don't we give it a couple of weeks? Why don't we give it a few weeks? She says she's going to be filing a lawsuit in Georgia. Jordan Sekulow, Jay Sekulow's son, the head of the American Center for Law and Justice, says there's going to be a shocking lawsuit filed in Georgia today or tomorrow. Let's wait and see what comes from all that. Because what I do hear the mainstream media trying to tell us that Dominion and Smartmatic are not related, that they're fierce competitors. Both of them have come out and said that. They've got spokespeople going on the air and saying there's nothing to see here. These are not Venezuelan companies. These are completely unrelated companies, etc. Now, that's the mainstream media story, and even they're fact-checking some of these stories on that. But the beautiful thing is that we have some clips from history that actually get into this. And, I had a number of clips to share. We're not going to get to all of them. Some of the clips involved some of the more left-leaning networks like MSNBC and PBS examining these machines before the election. Okay? MSNBC went down to a hacker conference in 2019 and talked about how this was incredibly dated technology and that it was alarming how easy it was to hack into these machines. PBS went to Georgia and one of the places where Dominion was operational and looked at these machines and found very troubling instances that these machines have no security on them and hackers can easily hack them. But let's just stay with the one point that we may be able to establish in the limited amount of time that we've got here on the show left, and that is whether there was some relationship between Dominion and Smartmatic. And there's actually a court case out there. Oh, very interesting. And in the court case, and what's so amazing is this would be available for any journalist to look up. There's actually a licensing agreement between the two companies that's part of the court case that includes a non-compete provision in the licensing agreement. So the concept that Dominion and Smartmatic were fierce competitors in engaged in marketplace competition is simply not true. It's disprovable by their own relationship. Now, I want to get to a clip from a guy named Mark Malloch Brown, or Lord Malloch Brown. He's a British diplomat, they call him, and actually is very involved with George Soros and the Open Society Foundation and other George Soros-related entities. And what he has to say, because, he's part of this whole group as well, these election machine manufacturers. So let's hear what he has to say about the relationship between the two.
Stretching that idea on credibility and integrity, you did unequivocally point out here that Smartmatic has never been a Venezuelan company, but correct me if I'm wrong, the chairman that had preceded you was a Venezuelan, yeah. And in fact, allegedly, Smartmatic had ties with the late former president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez. How do you explain all of that?
Well, I think the big word is allegedly. The former chairman, who is still CEO, so still very involved in the business, leads it, in fact, was a resident of Florida when these systems were designed.
Okay, the question on people's minds, why is Smartmatic even still here in the Philippines? After reports that it had violated provisions of the election automated law, number one, for example, that it was never supposed to be allowed to bid in the 2010 elections because it did not actually own the software. Dominion Voting Systems owned the software. Plus the difficulty which Smartmatic had to put the COMELEC through just in order to access the source code. Issues like that. Your thoughts? People say we should not be subjected to Smartmatic again this time around.
Well, look, I think that's competitors who say that. The fact is, yes, part of our technology is licensed from Dominion. But
okay, so there you go. Part of their technology is licensed from Dominion, so the truth comes out. Now, we got to go to Philippine TV to get it right. But, we're not the only country in the world that's concerned about these relationships and the relationships with Venezuela. Now, the other clip that I have for you that I really want to get to, and we're fast running out of time, but this is a bombshell. This is back from the Lou Dobbs show on CNN in 2006, and I want to run this one, if we got time, in its entirety. So I'm going to give it a go here and let it run because you're going to hear some very interesting stuff about these entities.
Of another amnesty in the future. A firm owned by Venezuela could be allowed to take over one of this country's top voting machine firms. Venezuela, of course, led by Hugo Chavez, working to change the views of most South American countries, move to the left. Critics of the deal say our nation's very democracy is now for sale without anyone doing a thing about it. Kitty Pilgrim reports.
The use of some 19,000 electronic voting machines in the city of Chicago and Cook County primary on March 21st of this year is now under intense scrutiny. The U.S. company that makes the machines, Sequoia, was bought in 2005 by Smartmatic, a private company primarily owned by Venezuelan businessmen. When Chicago had problems with the machines, a dozen Venezuelan employees were there to help with the election. Chicago officials are outraged.
I think that American elections ought to be run by American companies and ought to be run by American citizens, not Venezuelan nationals.
Smartmatic is technically based in Boca Raton, Florida, but the president of the company, Jack Blaine, testified to the Chicago City Council. Fewer than a dozen Smartmatic employees work in Florida. The majority of the workers are based in Venezuela. Watchdog groups question why U.S. voting machines would be under the control of citizens of another country, especially a country whose own election process is highly suspect.
We believe this is a national security issue. There is no way that companies belonging to non-U.S. corporations should have access to our elections.
Well, you can say that again. Now, we're not going to get through the entire clip, but there you go. It's a Venezuelan-owned and operated company. Everything that they've tried to deny, all the fact checks that the mainstream media has run saying, oh, that's not true, you're just a conspiracy theorist. Well, there it was in 2006 on none other than CNN. Okay, so, and CNN was concerned about it back in 2006. This year, nobody in the mainstream media is concerned about it because the only thing they're concerned about is making sure that Joe Biden is ultimately the winner of the election. Folks, thanks for joining us. I'm Morgan Streetman, and that's the way I see it. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.